The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like something wounded, and Katie Rodriguez kept her eyes forward as she clipped her badge to the waistband of her scrubs. Mercy General in Raleigh didn't know what she was. That was the point. Had been the point for 6 years, ever since Sanjin, ever since the classified operations file that officially didn't exist, ever since she'd been ordered to disappear so completely that dead women don't file tax returns or ask for promotions. Her forearms showed the scars. Thin white lines mapping old geography, shrapnel from an IED outside Helmand province, 3 stitches she'd done herself in a field tent because medics were busy with worse. The scars caught light when she moved, pale against tan skin, and she'd learned to angle her arms just so when Dr. Sterling swept past with his retinue of residents trailing behind like ducklings following a swan that had learned to wear Rolex watches. The new badge holder read, Katie Rodriguez, RN. Not her rank. Never her rank. That was locked in a Pentagon file stamped classified and sealed under the National Defense Authorization Act. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, that woman didn't exist anymore. That woman had hauled dying men through minefields. That woman had kept a Delta Force colonel alive for 2 kilometers under Taliban fire while her own left leg bled through a tourniquet she'd applied with her teeth. That woman had been ordered to vanish, and so Katie the new nurse had appeared instead, quiet and deferential and perfectly, exhaustingly invisible. She moved through the hospital's corridors with the kind of competence that nobody noticed. The 4 bags that fell before hitting the floor, caught by hands that moved before her brain registered the motion. The code situation she anticipated 3 minutes before the monitors alarmed because her body recognized the pattern of a patient crashing the way other people recognized songs. The doctor's orders she questioned silently, filing away the inconsistencies, the dosing errors, the decisions made from ego instead of evidence. She kept her eyes down when Dr. Sterling swept past, his white coat trailing like a flag of Dominion, and she said, of course, Dr. Sterling, and right away, Doctor in the soft, deferential voice she'd practiced for 6 years until it became a second skin. Inside her jacket, sewn against her ribs with surgical precision, was a faded Delta Force unit patch. She touched it once during her shift, a nervous habit, a talisman, a reminder of who she actually was when the world wasn't watching. The cloth was worn soft from decades of hands, the colors faded from sand and sun and things she'd been ordered never to mention. Nobody noticed when her fingers found it through the fabric. Nobody noticed anything about the trembling nurse with the scarred forearms and the too careful way she moved through Mercy General like someone trying not to take up space in a world that had explicitly ordered her to disappear. But when alarm sounded, her hands went still. Not with fear. With something older than fear. Muscle memory carved into her nervous system by 12 years of service, by 3 combat tours, by the kind of training that doesn't forget even when the government orders amnesia. The trembling stopped. Her breathing dropped to 4 counts in, 4 counts out, a rhythm learned in Sanjin under mortar fire. Her pupils dilated. The room came into sharp focus, all the irrelevant details bleeding away until only the critical information remained: patient, equipment, timeline. She didn't know that Dr. Sterling had noticed. Room for 12 was 2 floors up and 3 corridors over, and when Katie pushed the med cart down the hallway at 0800 hours, her hands were steady. The colonel was propped at a 45-degree angle, recovering from gunshot wounds that had tunneled through muscle and missed critical structures by distances that prayer alone couldn't measure. He had thick dark hair and the kind of eyes that had seen things that changed the architecture of a person's brain. He had a tattoo on his left forearm that made her stomach drop the same way it had when she first saw it 6 years ago in Sanjin, her name, inked in bold capitals, Katie. She'd never told him to get it. She'd never told him her last name, actually. She'd been call sign only, Reaper, because she moved through combat zones and enemies stopped breathing and nobody asked questions about how it happened. But he'd found out her first name somehow, and he'd found a needle and ink in a forward operating base with walls made of sandbags and prayer, and he'd burned her name into his skin like a promise. Or a reminder. Or a prayer of his own. Katie delivered his medication without making eye contact. Her hands were steady as she adjusted his full line, as she checked his vital signs, as she made notes on his chart. Clinical. Professional. Invisible. And then she looked at his face, and his eyes moved right through her like she was made of glass. Like she was one of the medical staff, interchangeable and forgettable. Like she was nobody to him. Like Sanjin had never happened. She swallowed hard. Turned away. Made a note about his O2 saturation, his blood pressure, the heart rate climbing slightly, elevated anxiety, possibly, though she knew better than to write that. Patients didn't get noted as anxious. They got noted as compliant or non-compliant, stable or unstable. Katie was writing stable when she felt it, the weight of observation, the precise attention of someone watching her pause at the doorway to room for 12. Dr. Sterling stood at the nurse's station 15 feet away, his tablet raised like a weapon, and he smiled. The smile of a predator that had just spotted prey. The smile of someone who had noticed that the new nurse's hands trembled before alarm sounded, and who had also noticed that her hands stopped trembling precisely when they should go wild. The smile of a man who understood hierarchy so completely that any deviation from the bottom made his teeth show. Katie didn't meet his eyes. She turned back to her cart. Continued pushing. Said good morning to the resident she passed in the corridor, a young woman whose name was Chen and who flinched when Dr. Sterling appeared, and Katie recognized that flinch. She'd seen it in bathroom mirrors for 6 years. The hospital moved at its own rhythm, the one Dr. Sterling conducted like a symphony written specifically to remind everyone exactly how small they were. The residents orbited him during rounds like planets orbiting the sun. He corrected them in front of patients, dismissing their suggestions with a hand wave that carried the force of institutional authority. He called the nurses by nicknames that weren't quite insults but occupied the space just before insults began: sweetheart for Katie, sunshine for the older nurses, doc for the male nurses, always with a smile that showed his teeth. Katie watched him operate. This was her skill now, observation. She'd learned it in Sanjin, where you read a landscape for the places where enemies hid. Now she read the hospital's social architecture the same way. Dr. Sterling maintained his power through a precise combination of competence and cruelty. He was genuinely skilled, his diagnosis work was sharp, his surgical reasoning sound. But he'd woven that competence so completely into his personality that questioning his methods felt like questioning gravity. The residents didn't challenge him. The nurses certainly didn't. The hospital administration had clearly decided that a surgeon who could quote his complication rates at 3% was worth whatever damage his personality caused to the staff. Katie saw it all. She saw the way his attention carved up the department, the way some people received eye contact and others received the back of his hand. She saw how he'd strategically placed himself as the only voice that mattered. She saw the residents taking notes on everything he said because they understood, bone deep, that their careers depended on his approval. She'd learned about power structures in the military, learned them in the hard way, in the tradecraft of keeping people alive under fire, and she recognized the architecture here. Different uniform, same tyranny. What haunted her most was not the colonel's eyes moving through her like she didn't exist. What haunted her was that this was exactly what she'd been told to expect when she took the civilian job, when she'd agreed to the erasure. Dead women don't ask for recognition. Dead women don't surface. Dead women became nurses at hospitals where nobody knew that their hands had held lives together in minefields, that their voice had kept 5 men calm while one of them died anyway, that their decisions had changed the trajectory of the war in their sector by 7.3%, a number so classified that even thinking it in her own head felt like treason. The shift moved forward. She delivered medications with clinical precision. She monitored patients. She caught for bags before they fell. She read the subtle language of the monitors, the way oxygen saturation told stories, the way blood pressure revealed lies, the way the heart's electrical rhythm announced what the mouth wouldn't say. This was the thing about nursing that nobody mentioned in the marketing videos: you learn to speak a language of bodies, and you learn to hear what medicine had forgotten how to listen for. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part happened during the afternoon, when Dr. Sterling conducted rounds with his residents, when Katie was prepping medications in the clean room with walls that muffled sound but not intention. She heard him through the intercom system, his voice projected into the hallway like a broadcast: we have to maintain standards. Quality care requires hierarchy. Residents have to understand their place before they can understand medicine. One of the residents said something Katie couldn't quite hear. Dr. Sterling responded with a laugh. Exactly. These nurses will try to tell you they know better, but they're just nurses. Let them follow protocol and stay in their lane. Katie's hands continued working. Syringes lined up like soldiers. Medications verified. Doses calculated. Her hands didn't tremble. They moved with the kind of precision that came from having been trained to save lives in the worst conditions imaginable, under fire, with instruments that weren't sterile and surgical fields that were just pieces of desert you claimed in the name of keeping people breathing. She touched the unit patch inside her jacket. Felt the faded Delta Force emblem. Felt the weight of the 6 years she'd been carrying it, invisible under her scrubs, against her skin like a secret that was slowly destroying her. The thing about being ordered to disappear was that eventually, you stopped believing you'd ever existed at all. Morning rounds at Mercy General moved like a predator circling wounded prey. 8 residents trailed Dr. Sterling through the cardiac unit, their notepads poised, their faces arranged in the careful blankness of people learning to worship hierarchy. Katie pushed the med cart alongside them, her voice steady as she reported vitals from the previous shift. Room for 12 shows slight ST elevation on the last EKG. I flagged it for cardiology consultant. Sweetheart, maybe let the actual medical professionals handle the thinking parts. Dr. Sterling didn't glance at her. He turned to the residents with a smile that tasted like vinegar. This is what happens when we hire nurses who watch too many hospital dramas. Every beat becomes a code. Every rhythm variation becomes a conspiracy. The residents laughed. 8 pairs of eyes slid past Katie like she was invisible. Her hand stayed folded against her scrubs. Her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't change. But something deep in her chest, the part that had carried wounded men through Taliban territory, that had held pressure on arterial bleeds while mortars fell like rain, that part registered the predator circling closer. She'd survived worse than laughter. She'd survived things no hospital would ever imagine. But survival had rules, and the first rule was, don't show teeth when you're trying to stay alive. By that afternoon, the punishment had already begun. Katie's patient assignments tripled. 12 beds instead of 4. Other nurses working the same floor got 6, sometimes 5. Dr. Sterling moved through the unit assigning workload like he was distributing gift baskets, pausing at Katie's station with calculated casualness. Let's see how our trauma enthusiast handles a real census. Jump in. She jumped in. That night at the staff meeting, 20 people sat in the conference room with their coffee cups and their tired eyes, waiting for announcements about the new computer charting system. Dr. Sterling stood at the whiteboard with a marker in his hand and something predatory in his posture. I want to run a little office pool, he said, his voice carrying the texture of smooth motor oil. I give our new trauma recruit here 1 week before she runs crying back to whatever rural clinic hired her last. He looked at Katie. Smiled. Who's in? Hands rose. Cash exchanged. Katie watched the odds being calculated, her assignment of 12 patients suddenly making sense. It wasn't incompetence. It was methodology. Systematic. Scientific. The kind of destruction that could be documented, justified, defended in any investigation as normal hospital operations. 20 people laughed. She heard it like distant thunder, rolling across a valley she'd already learned to cross alone. The cafeteria happened on day 4. For days of triple loads, for days of Dr. Sterling interrupting her during rounds, for days of written warnings appearing in her mailbox for policy violations she hadn't committed, late medication times stamped when she was off shift, missing documentation she'd personally filed in triplicate. Her performance review from that morning read like a termination blueprint, each item careful enough to survive scrutiny, damaging enough to destroy. She carried her lunch tray through the crowded cafeteria at noon, tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. The tray held a salad, some kind of chicken, water. Nothing expensive. Nothing that would matter. Dr. Sterling's table occupied the center of the room. 7 other attendings, 3 surgical residents, a radiologist. 40 staff members scattered around them at various distances, all aware that the center of the room was not where people like Katie belonged. She passed the table. Her foot landed on tile that was still slick from the morning cleaning crew. Maybe she didn't notice. Maybe her body was responding to something else, the ambient tension, the weight of being watched by people who were hungry for a show. Dr. Sterling's hand moved. Casual. Accidental. His arm swept against the edge of her tray with the precision of someone who'd practiced the motion in his mind 100 times. The tray went airborne. Gravity didn't care about intentions. Soup splashed across the floor in a sound like a gunshot. Silverware scattered across tile with a noise like artillery landing. The plate bounced once and shattered. The water glass followed, exploding on impact, sending glass shards across the floor in a glittering spray that caught the fluorescent lights like diamonds. The cafeteria went silent. The refrigerator hummed. An ice machine somewhere clicked and cycled. 40 people held their breath. Katie didn't move. She stood there with her empty tray, her hand still positioned where they'd been holding it, and she watched Dr. Sterling lean back in his chair. He reached for the patient chart stacked on a nearby cart, the one she'd just updated, the ones that contained her notes and her assessments, and he lifted them with both hands. Smiled. Threw them at her feet. Paper scattered across the contaminated floor, scattering into soup and glass and water. Her documentation, her assessments, her medical notes, all of it landing in the wreckage like trash. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. His smile was the kind that made pain into performance art. The room crystallized into a single moment. 40 staff members watching. 3 residents taking notes. 7 attendings waiting to see if she would break. If she would cry. If she would run. If she would give them the show they'd all purchased into with their laughter and their silence and their complicity. Katie knelt. Her scrubs absorbed the liquid. Her hands gathered the papers, separating them from the glass, from the food debris, from the wreckage of everything he'd engineered. Her movements were mechanical. Precise. The kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, from years of operating under pressure, from hands that had done worse things in worse circumstances. One tear escaped. She let it fall without reaching for it, let it track down her cheek as she remained on her knees, gathering his deliberate cruelty into a neat stack. When she stood, her eyes met his. Her voice came out in a register lower than it had been a moment before, steady as surgical steel, words that came from a part of her that Dr. Sterling would never understand. "I'd carried dying men through minefields in San Jin. I held pressure on wounds while bullets came through the walls. I can certainly handle your paperwork, doctor." The room went dead silent. Not shocked silent. Threat silent. The kind of silence that arrives when someone's composure stops being a disadvantage and becomes evidence of something else entirely. Dr. Sterling's smile tightened. His jaw moved once. His hand released the coffee cup he'd been holding, and it made a small sound as it settled back onto the table. Katie walked away carrying the wet papers. Her back remained straight. Her chin remained level. She did not run. She did not cry. She did not break, and that precise refusal to break, was the moment he decided to destroy her completely. By that afternoon, his phone was ringing. 3 board members by evening. Each call carefully crafted, each message weighted with insinuation rather than accusation. "We're seeing some red flags with medication counts. Did you ever notice anything concerning?" His voice would be worried, professional, the tone of someone genuinely concerned about a colleague's welfare. His references to Katie would be oblique enough to survive scrutiny but specific enough to plant seeds. By the next morning, an investigator from the state nursing board would be waiting in the hospital administrator's office with a folder of evidence, fabricated documentation, manufactured policy violations, a paper trail that seemed to materialize from nowhere. That night, Katie sat at her kitchen table in Raleigh with rain hammering the windows like persistent hands trying to break the glass. Her daughter Emma, 7 years old with Katie's dark eyes and someone else's obliviousness to danger, was upstairs sleeping. Marcus, her grown son home from college for the weekend, was in the living room pretending not to notice how his mother's hand shook when she thought no one was watching. She pulled out the faded unit patch from the inside of her jacket lining. The one she'd worn sewn into her uniform through 3 deployments, through Sanjin Valley, through operations that didn't exist on any official record. The patch that connected her to a name that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. The government order from 6 years ago sat in a vault somewhere, unwritten officially, understood absolutely, disappear. Your records are erased. Your decorations are sealed. Your service is classified to a level that means you're dead to every database that matters. Never surface. Never speak. Never acknowledge that you were ever anything other than a woman with a nursing degree and a clean slate. She'd obeyed because that's what operators do. Because someone with classified access told her to vanish, and you don't argue with that voice, that authority, that absolute conviction that your existence had become a liability. But the colonel in room for 12 had her name tattooed on his forearm, and every time she passed his bed, she felt the weight of it, the recognition she wasn't allowed to acknowledge, the past she wasn't allowed to claim, the identity she'd buried so deep that she'd started to believe it was dead. The rain kept falling. She held the patch under the kitchen lamplight, feeling the weight of 6 years of invisibility, 6 years of being ordered to be nobody, 6 years of watching the man she'd saved stare through her like she was part of the hospital furniture. And tomorrow, Dr. Sterling would send his formal complaint to Human Resources. He would request her immediate suspension pending investigation. He would copy 5 board members with carefully worded phrases that suggested impropriety without stating it directly. He would ensure that every hospital in Raleigh knew her name was now synonymous with doubt. What he didn't know was that doubt was the only thing she'd ever been able to survive. By 8:56 a.m., Dr. Sterling had already made 7 phone calls. The first 3 went to Katie's previous employers, St. Augustine Medical Center in Charlotte, Duke University Hospital, and Coastal Carolina General near Wilmington. He didn't accuse her directly. That would have left evidence. Instead, he posed careful questions to department heads he'd cultivated over 20 years of hospital politics. "I'm just trying to understand her background before we make any permanent decisions," he'd said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "Has anyone ever raised concerns about her attention to detail? Her willingness to follow protocols?" The insinuations hung in the air like smoke. Red flags without saying the words red flag. By 9:15 a.m., the first blacklist notation appeared in the hospital credentialing system, a single line, previous performance concerns. Recommend verification before hire. The state board investigator arrived at 9:22 a.m. His name was Robert Chen, and he carried a leather folder that looked identical to the one Dr. Sterling had prepared the night before. There were fabricated incident reports, time-stamped performance reviews documenting violations that never occurred, and 7 pages of manufactured policy breaches, medication administration errors she never made, documentation failures she never committed, patient safety concerns that existed only in Dr. Sterling's meticulous handwriting. Katie was in room for 12, checking the colonel's vitals, when the investigator was already in Dr. Sterling's office, nodding as the doctor explained the situation with the gravity of a man protecting his institution. "I hate to be the one to say this, but she's a liability," Dr. Sterling said, his face arranged in the expression of someone bearing an unfortunate burden. "I documented everything because I knew this moment would come. Nurses like that, they're time bombs." Katie didn't know any of this yet. She was focused on the fall line in the colonel's arm, on the slight elevation of his neck veins, on the way his breathing had changed since 6 a.m. Something was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Just the kind of wrong that lives in the spaces between the monitors, in the small shifts that doctors miss when they're too busy building empires. She adjusted his oxygen and made a note in his chart, nothing that would catch Dr. Sterling's attention, nothing that would trigger another confrontation. By 10:15 a.m., the second investigator had arrived, this one from the state nursing board itself, and they were already interviewing 3 residents who Dr. Sterling had quietly spoken to over coffee. The residents hadn't wanted to say anything. But when your attending physician carefully explains that a nurse might be a risk to patient safety, when he asks if you've noticed anything concerning, you start noticing things. Fear is a powerful director of attention. By 11:23 a.m., Katie still didn't know. She was eating a granola bar between patients, scrolling through her phone, when her supervisor, Linda, appeared at her locker with the kind of expression that precedes bad news. "Katie, can you come with me?" Those 6 words contained the weight of institutional machinery already in motion. Linda didn't make eye contact in the elevator. That was the tell. If it had been something minor, Linda would have looked at her. The absence of that eye contact meant Katie was already being processed out of the system. The Human Resources office on the 3rd floor smelled like cheap coffee and the particular staleness of spaces where difficult conversations happened regularly. 2 people Katie had never met before sat across from a desk. One was the investigator. The other was hospital security. "We've completed our preliminary review," the investigator said. His folder sat closed on the desk between them like a verdict. "There are significant concerns about your performance. Policy violations, documentation failures, medication administration discrepancies. We're recommending immediate suspension pending a full investigation." He opened the folder. Katie saw her name on documents she'd never signed, dates she'd worked, shifts, procedures she'd never performed. The specificity was what made it terrifying. Not vague accusations, but precise fabrications. Times. Doses. Patient names. Dr. Sterling had been thorough. He'd built this structure with the architectural precision of a man who'd destroyed careers before. "I need to see the specific incidents," Katie said. Her voice was level, steady, the voice of someone who'd survived worse than paperwork. The investigator slid 3 pages across the desk. All of it was wrong. Every single entry was manufactured, but it was manufactured in a way that looked real. In a way that would hold up to casual scrutiny. In a way that matched the documentation style of every other incident report in the hospital system. Dr. Sterling had studied her handwriting, studied her documentation patterns, and created mirror images of things she'd never done. "These are fabricated," Katie said. "Not an accusation. A statement of fact." The investigator's expression didn't change. "That will be determined during the full investigation. For now, you are suspended effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your personal items." The security officer, a man named Marcus who'd always nodded politely when she passed in the hallway, stood up. He'd been instructed not to look at her. So he didn't. "Your hospital credentials are suspended. You'll need to contact your union representative if you wish to contest this." By 11:11 a.m., Katie was walking through the corridors of Mercy General with Marcus 2 steps behind her, following the path she'd walked every day for the last 4 months. Other nurses saw her. Word would spread before she reached the parking lot. The rumor mill at any hospital runs at the speed of fear, and fear travels fast when it involves potential litigation. She opened her locker. There was a photo of her daughter Emma taped to the inside of the door, Emma at her 8th grade graduation, gap-toothed smile, holding a certificate Katie had cried over in private. Katie pulled down her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the one that no one had ever seen because no one was supposed to see it. She folded it carefully and placed it in her bag. Her trauma shears went in next, the engraved ones with her old call sign worn smooth from years of field work. The stethoscope that had belonged to her mentor in Sanjin, the one she'd carried out with his dog tag sewn into the earpiece tubing where no casual observer would notice. By 12:03 p.m., Katie was driving home in a car that suddenly felt too quiet. She'd expected many things when she took this job. Disrespect. Institutional indifference. The kind of systematic dismissal that any woman in medicine learned to navigate like geography. But she hadn't expected Dr. Sterling to move this fast. Hadn't expected the machinery to engage so completely, so thoroughly, so absolutely. Blacklists worked differently than she'd thought. By noon, 3 hospitals had already received calls. Not from the state board, from Dr. Sterling directly, physician to physician, careful words about concerning patterns, about risk assessment, about due diligence. The calls had shaped themselves into barriers before Katie even knew the first door had closed. She pulled into the driveway at 2:17 p.m. The house was quiet in the way houses get quiet when someone expects you to come home at 5 p.m., not 2 p.m. Emma was at school still. Katie had 2 hours before she'd have to explain something she couldn't explain. She sat at the kitchen table with a lunch she couldn't bring herself to eat, turkey sandwich, apple slices, the things she'd prepared that morning when she still had a job, still had a career, still had a future that looked like it stretched into recognizable territory. The kettle sat cold on the stove. The refrigerator hummed its mechanical rhythm. Outside, rain had started, the kind of rain that sounds like it's never going to stop, like it's the natural state of the world and sunshine was just a rumor someone told you once. Katie's hands rested on the table in front of her, and for the first time that day, she really looked at them. Hands that had held lives together in Sanjin. Hands that had performed field surgery under mortar fire. Hands that had performed a pericardiocentesis on a dying colonel at 2 a.m. while residents watched and learned something they'd remember for the rest of their careers. Those hands had been enough in the mountains. Those hands had been enough in the trauma bay. But they weren't enough here. In Raleigh. In a hospital where the real threat didn't wear a uniform or carry a gun. The real threat wore a white coat and had the institutional machinery of 3 boards standing behind him like soldiers in formation. Katie thought about calling her union representative. Thought about contacting a lawyer. Thought about fighting back through channels designed specifically to protect people like her, designed specifically to stop people like Dr. Sterling. Then she thought about the colonel. About the promise she'd made in Sanjin that no one left behind. She'd left behind her name. She'd left behind her rank. She'd left behind every medal, every commendation, every proof that she'd ever been anything other than a nurse named Katie who appeared one day at Mercy General and was now disappearing just as quickly. The government had made that very clear 6 years ago. Dead women don't ask for recognition. Stay invisible or don't come home at all. By 2:45 p.m., the rain was heavier. Katie sat with her untouched lunch and her silent hands and her jacket with the hidden patch, and she didn't cry. She'd learned long ago that crying was a luxury for people whose lives made sense. Her life hadn't made sense for 6 years. It wasn't going to start now. The heart monitor showed what the blood work couldn't yet tell, a pattern that sang danger in 4 quiet beeps that turned into 3, then 2. Katie stood in room for 12 at 1:27 a.m. with her stethoscope pressed against the colonel's chest, listening for something that shouldn't be there. Muffled. Like hearing a drumbeat through water. His neck veins distended, pushing outward with each shallow breath he took. Pericardial tamponade. Blood was pooling inside the sac surrounding his heart, squeezing it like a fist closing, stealing the room the organ needed to pump. She'd felt this rhythm before, in a burning compound outside Sanjin with mortar fire walking across the roof and a Delta operator bleeding into his own chest cavity. The attending physician was asleep in the call room. Dr. Sterling wouldn't answer his phone. The protocol said to wait. The protocol said to notify. The protocol said a new nurse didn't make decisions that belonged to doctors who had studied longer and earned the right to be wrong. Katie pulled the crash cart closer and didn't wait. Her hands moved through the steps like muscle memory retrieving something buried 6 years ago. Sterile field. Chlorhexidine scrub in concentric circles. The ultrasound probe showed exactly what she already knew, dark fluid surrounding the heart's right atrium, the pericardium visibly tense. She found the angle. 5th intercostal space, below the xiphoid process. The 18-gauge needle felt light as air between her fingers as she advanced through skin, through fascia, through the pericardial membrane. There. The sudden give that meant entry. She was in. The first withdrawal brought rust-colored blood into the syringe. 300 milliliters. The monitor's beeps climbed. 4 beeps per second. 5. The rhythm accelerated as the pressure released. The colonel's blood pressure climbed from 68 systolic to 79. The needle had become a lifeline, and her hands knew every millimeter of its path because her hands had learned this skill in a place where there were no attending physicians, no call buttons, no time to wait for permission. 8 residents stood frozen at the ICU observation window. None of them moved. None of them called for backup. None of them stopped her because what they were watching wasn't the violation of protocol, it was competence operating at a frequency they recognized but had never actually seen. A nurse withdrawing blood that was suffocating a man's heart. A procedure that shouldn't exist outside operating rooms, outside the hands of surgeons, and yet here it was, precise and calm and performed by someone whose badge said RODIGUEZ, RN, Mercy General, 1 year of service. By 6 a.m., Katie was charting the procedure notes in the ICU corridor when Dr. Sterling walked in. His face went white before it went red. He read the documentation in the doorway, the timestamp, the clinical notes, the resident signatures acknowledging what they'd witnessed. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth made an audible sound. He didn't ask if the colonel survived. He didn't ask what her training was. He turned and walked back down the hall without speaking, and that silence was more dangerous than any words he could have thrown. 20 minutes later, the phone call started. Katie was in the locker room when 2 Mercy General security officers appeared in the doorway. They wore the uniforms of men following orders, and their eyes held the discomfort of people enforcing something they didn't understand. One of them cleared his throat. "Ms. Rodriguez, you need to come with us." It wasn't a request. It was a command. She followed them down the corridor where shift change was happening. 50 nurses and techs watched her badge being confiscated at the front desk. The HR director waited by the main entrance with a folder and a script about unauthorized procedures and scope of practice violations. Her voice had the hollow quality of someone reading words Dr. Sterling had written. "The decision is final, Ms. Rodriguez. Security will escort you from the property." Katie asked one question. "The colonel?" The HR director didn't answer. Just gestured toward the exit. By noon, 3 hospitals in Raleigh had her flagged in their credentialing systems. Dr. Sterling's network moved with the precision of a man who'd spent years cultivating favors and collecting loyalty. The narrative was already in motion before Katie's apartment door closed behind her, unstable nurse, practicing outside her scope, unauthorized procedures that could have killed her patient if she'd been less reckless. A dangerous liability that the hospital was fortunate to have removed. She sat at the kitchen table at 2 p.m. with her lunch untouched. Chicken breast. Steamed broccoli. A bottle of water perspiring rings onto the wood. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. No tremor. No racing heart. The same hands that had operated at 1:11 a.m. were now perfectly still, folded on the table like they belonged to someone else. The door opened at 3:15 p.m. and Emma came through, backpack heavy on her 7-year-old shoulders, face confused. "Mommy, why are you home? You work nights." The question was innocent. The question broke something. Katie couldn't explain that the government had ordered her to disappear 6 years ago, that her records had been sealed in a vault somewhere in Washington, that officially she didn't exist because dead women don't ask for recognition or benefits or answers about the men they carried through minefields. She couldn't explain that she'd kept her silence and her head down and taught her daughter to do the same, and in 6 minutes of surgical precision at 1:33 a.m., she'd become visible. She couldn't explain any of it. So she held her daughter instead, and let one measured breath escape while Emma patted her hair and asked if everything was okay. Marcus called at 7:45 p.m. from his dorm room. His voice came through the phone trembling in a way hers never could. "Mom, I read about a nurse at Mercy General." "Was that?" Katie cut him off. It was necessary. She heard him breathing. Heard the weight of his question before he asked it. "Are they going to do something to you?" She wanted to lie. She wanted to tell him it would be fine, that she'd find another job, that this was just a bump in the road she'd been walking down since the day she'd sworn she'd disappear. Instead, she told him the truth in the smallest possible voice. "That's why we disappeared the first time." The silence on the line lasted 3 seconds. Then Marcus said, "I'm proud of you," and hung up because there was nothing else to say. She didn't see the Colonel wake at 4 a.m. on day 3. Didn't see his eyes focus on the ICU ceiling. Didn't see him look at his forearm where her name was still tattooed there, black ink faded to the color of old bruises. Didn't see him ask the attending nurse a single question that would start cascading through military channels like dominoes made of classified information and federal databases, and the kind of alarms that only sound when something supposedly erased suddenly reappears. What happened next didn't just change Katie's life. It ended a career. The 6 a.m. briefing room at FBI Field Office Raleigh smelled like burnt coffee and certainty. Special Agent Chen had evidence that didn't require interpretation: fabricated medication logs, forged state investigation documents, digital timestamps showing Dr. Sterling's attempt 3 hours ago to access federal databases and delete Katie Rodriguez's entire military service file. A felony. The kind that triggered automatic alerts at the Pentagon. Chen's hands moved across her laptop keyboard, each keystroke opening another door into Sterling's calculated demolition of a woman he'd mistaken for powerless. Falsified personnel records. Scripted phone calls to 3 hospitals. An entire architecture of lies constructed by a man who'd never learned that some people don't break under pressure, they become weaponized by it. The arrest warrant was signed at 5:44 a.m. FBI Special Agent James Chen, 52 years old, 19 years with the Bureau, daughter of Navy aviators, had handled corruption cases involving judges, senators, and defense contractors. None of them had tried to erase a decorated combat veteran from federal records. That was new. That was the moment when arrogance became federal crime. She knocked on Dr. Sterling's door at 6:14 a.m., 2 agents flanking her position like bookends on a collapsed argument, rain hammering the suburban driveway in Raleigh's Forest Hills neighborhood. Sterling answered in a Burberry robe, still confident. Still untouchable. Chen watched his face process the warrant, process the explanation, process the moment when institutional power meant nothing against 3 federal agents who'd already built their case in digital stone. Dr. Sterling, you contacted the North Carolina Medical Board with fabricated investigation documentation. Chen's voice carried the weight of someone who'd rehearsed this once and learned it perfectly. You falsified performance reviews. You called 3 hospitals with scripted insinuations about medication diversion. And 3 hours ago, you attempted to access and delete classified military service records from federal databases belonging to Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. She turned the laptop toward him. Screen showing his IP address. Timestamp. Login attempt. System rejection. Everything recorded. Everything irrefutable. You tried to erase a decorated war veteran from official government records to cover the fact that you delayed life-saving treatment and then destroyed her career when she saved the patient you refused to treat. The robe suddenly looked ridiculous. Sterling's attorney arrived at the station 3 hours later, already calculating damage control. The board members Sterling had cultivated for 17 years received calls from the FBI before breakfast. One resigned immediately. 2 others slid their chairs away from him at the next departmental meeting like he'd become contagious. His surgical privileges were suspended pending investigation. The state investigator he'd promised consulting fees to, a young man named Patterson, ambitious and corruptible, revealed in a recorded deposition that Sterling had explicitly promised him $15,000 for a predetermined outcome on Katie's case. Patterson's career evaporated. Sterling's network of favors and leverage and whispered phone calls collapsed in real time like a structure that had never been load-bearing at all. The news cameras arrived by 7 a.m. Local stations, then regional. They'd been briefed about the hero surgeon who'd innovated his way to saving a colonel's life during a press conference. Now they were watching federal agents walk that same surgeon to a sedan in handcuffs, his Rolex catching light, his wife's face behind the doorway holding an expression that suggested she'd married a stranger. The perp walk was broadcast live. Sterling's face was broadcast live. His hands behind his back were broadcast live to every hospital administrator in North Carolina who'd ever wondered if they'd made the right choice trusting him. By noon, 17 other nurses had come forward. Manufacturing complaints. Documented harassment. A pattern so clear it required no interpretation. One nurse described Sterling destroying her meal in the cafeteria in front of staff. Another described him throwing her charts at her feet. The systems that had protected him for years, credibility, seniority, male authority coded into medicine's DNA, suddenly didn't work anymore. Institutional power required invisible infrastructure. Disappear the infrastructure, and the power collapsed into a man in handcuffs who taught CPR certification at Community College for $18 per hour. 3 separate hospitals sent Katie official reinstatement letters within 48 hours. The Secretary of the Navy called her personally at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Katie sat in her kitchen, her daughter Emma at school, and listened to words like service, valor, and the official restoration of record. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. Shaking was for people who weren't trained in compartmentalization. She'd learned to separate the body from the moment years ago in Sanjin, in a valley where trembling was a luxury the mission wouldn't afford. 6 months later, Walter Reed Medical Center's trauma surgery floor opened for the morning rounds. Katie Rodriguez walked those corridors in Navy uniform, dress blues, the insignia on her collar reading Senior Chief Petty Officer in bright gold. Her hands had the muscle memory of field surgery. Her eyes had the flat calm of someone who'd seen worse than anything a hospital could present. On her first day in the new office, she'd unpinned the faded Delta Force unit patch from inside her jacket lining where it had been hidden for 6 years. Not hidden anymore. Not secret. She mounted it in a shadow box above her desk, right next to a photograph of Colonel Thorne shaking her hand at the promotion ceremony, his forearm visible in the frame, her name in black ink on his skin, Senior Chief Katie Rodriguez, finally acknowledged in permanent marking, finally visible. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hum. Rain drummed the hospital windows. Katie's new team didn't know yet that she'd performed a pericardiocentesis at 2 a.m. without authorization. Didn't know about Sanjin. Didn't know that the stillness in her movements was the kind that came from surviving worse than humiliation. They just knew that when a critical patient arrived, their new trauma surgeon moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd already held death in her hands and learned to negotiate with it. A young Marine came through the doors at 3 p.m. with shrapnel in his abdomen from Syria. Katie saw her younger self in his eyes, the fear, the disorientation, the moment when you realize your body is no longer a given. She steadied him with a voice that carried the weight of someone who'd been broken and rebuilt into something stronger. "I've got you. You're safe now. We've done this 1,000 times." The surgery took 84 minutes. The Marine survived with function intact. That night, Katie video called Emma and Marcus, finally whole and informed, no more secrets required by the government that had owned her silence. Emma had questions. Marcus had enrolled in basic training after learning what his mother had done, following the path she'd walked. They talked for 2 hours while Katie sat in her Walter Reed office, the unit patch visible above her desk, the photograph right next to it. Dr. Sterling taught CPR at Raleigh Community College in room 237 on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. His students didn't know his history. He was just the bitter instructor who took too long on break, whose eyes carried something like regret that nobody asked about. His medical license was restricted to non-clinical education. His trial was pending on 3 federal charges. His wife had filed for divorce. His children weren't taking his calls. His colleagues had quietly erased him from hospital communications. The infrastructure that had protected him was gone, and what remained was a man in a fluorescent-lit community college room teaching CPR to healthcare workers who would never know his name as anything but the instructor. Katie walked Walter Reed corridors the next morning in Navy uniform, and hospital staff snapped salutes. She touched the unit patch on her collar, small gesture, barely visible, carrying the weight of 6 years of erasure and 1 day of visibility that couldn't be taken back. Her reflection in the polished floor showed both versions, nurse and warrior, healer and combatant, no longer hidden. No longer carrying her name only on a dead man's forearm. Carrying it on her collar now. Carrying it in official records. Carrying it visible. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. If this story resonates with you, subscribe to our channel for more narratives about hidden strength and justice restored. Leave a comment telling us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And share this with someone who needs to know that buried truths resurface when heroism demands visibility.